I don't know why. I don't know. It's still doing it. Check. There we go. Um, yeah, I don't know why it's defaulting to this mic. It's not supposed to do that. Let me boost the volume up just a tiny bit. Check, check, check. Hello, hello, hello. Check. All right. So here we go. I only told you all about this Q and A at the last minute, and I'm sure it's going to take a while for people to catch up. So here we go. We got one person. And no theme today, just because I didn't have time to like work my way through that. Um, so what can I tell you? This week we did publish the physical version of the major scale expansion studies. That's good news. So as of the 15th, and let me check, it might be listed already because the last time I checked a different book, um, it was listed before. Yes, it actually is. So on Amazon already, it's to be released tomorrow. But it's already on there if you need to like bookmark it or something. I can put the link here. So this is a book that we, oh, is it like too long or what? Yeah, it's too long. Let me see here. Let me shorten that link. So, yeah, that's a better link. Okay. So this is a book we already had as an ebook on my website and some other websites too. And I had a customer that asked, "Where's this book in physical format?" And then other people started asking about it too. So this is the major scale expansion studies that we do. I had a student ask me, "Should I be doing the expansion studies?" I said, "No, you already know the skills. This is not a book for people that already know their skills. Now, if you struggle a lot with the skills, then it might be all right. If you struggle a lot, like you keep playing the wrong notes all the time in your scales, this might be a good, uh, like, starting over type thing. But if you don't feel like you need to start over, then there's no need for, no need for um, doing this. This is really for people who are, you know, like not the beginners, right? Because the beginners, I have a different book for them that has these expansion studies built in. That's the Trumpet Pioneer tonalization study book. Actually has the expansion studies built in. So right now, until I change the Tyro tonalization studies, um, I start the students on this book after they finish that first level. So the Tyro level, I would have them start doing after they've done the tonalization studies again in the three keys they already know. Then we go to the tonalizations, to the expansion studies in the newer keys like two flats, two sharps, stuff like that. I can tell you that the students, I'm talking about the beginners, right? The beginners that I've had go through this system, it's remarkable. It's remarkable. Yeah. So when they, because, we were talking about this last week, right? We were talking about how to minimize the mistakes that you learn into the music. The same thing is true with the scales. The same thing is true with the scales. We've talked last week about slowing down the process. Hello, Seppo. Nice to see you. We talked about slowing down the process. Well, these uh, expansion studies go a long way towards slowing down the process of learning the scales. That's the kind of thing we were talking about last week. So, yes, I'm excited that it's going to be physical now, available as a physical book. I've got other books on the way. I think I told you guys I've been working on the books during my dialysis time. And the one that I'm most excited about right now is the tonalization. I'm going to call it the tonalization method. Okay. We're going to call it that for now. Um, to differentiate it from the tonalization studies. The tonalization studies are scale studies. The tonalization method is a bigger system than just the scales. So it's a lot like the one range book in that there's no exercises inside of it. It's all conceptual. The one range book is conceptual, and now the tonalization method book is also conceptual. So yes, that's what we're doing with that. Um, anyway, that's the news. I'm hoping that this year we put out literally a dozen different books. I've got someone working with me to get. Won't be long before we get the all of the different levels of the pentatonic tonalization studies put out. And there'll be, since we've got one of those out now, there'll be 6 more coming, hopefully by the end of the year. Sunstorm, which is Mr. Derek, I think, says, Mr. Lewis, hi. If we have never seriously and formally done scale work in the past, which tonalization book should we get? Um, so it doesn't matter. They all have the same exercises in them. Um, you just get the one that's consistent with your current range. Actually, I shouldn't have said it that way. It's not one book, right? So you have a different book. You know how we're doing the the different range limiting. Now you can range limit by buying the higher book and just not going that high. Um, and by the way, don't worry about that. If you're my student, I will put. A lot of people don't know this, that if you are my student, then I will put at least the digital version of whatever books you need in your Dropbox folder. And the only time you need to buy a book is when you want the physical version. I cannot obviously give out physical versions of the books. But yeah, whatever books you need, we will make sure are in your folder when you need them. That's just one of the perks of taking lessons with me. He says, I really don't mind paying. If you've put the hours into creating it, you've earned it. Yeah, I understand that. I understand that. Well, you know what? Here's the thing: is we put the books in the Dropbox folder anyway, so that in the lessons, because like you have Skype lessons, right? So in the lesson, I can pull it up, share screen, and we can navigate through the book without us having to say yes on measure page 3, measure 15, and it's so easy to get lost that way. By putting the books in your folder, I can share screen and put notes on it and stuff like that. And then when we come back to it again, it's got your old notes because I save it at the end of the lesson. So that's just part of how I do the lessons. And then afterwards, if you want to go to that, then, like I said, I'm not trying to discourage you from buying the books. But the lessons, I said this in that video that I did, the hierarchy of what did I call it? Hierarchy of support. The hierarchy of support. And I know that's not, I don't ever do clickbait, right? But sometimes the problem with not doing clickbait is people don't know really why they should watch that video, right? So, and that video might be one of those. That one might actually be one of those that people don't know whether or not they should watch it or not. Um, so yes, it's and at the very end of the video, I say that you guys who are taking lessons are already doing more than everybody else. You know, the on the bottom end is people clicking like on the video. No, don't get me wrong. I'm not. I appreciate when people do that. Um, clicking like, clicking subscribe and stuff like that. All of that does help. Listening to the videos, like the music videos and stuff like that, or listening on to the music on uh on Spotify or whatever. But when you compare what we get from that to uh how much you guys pay for lessons. Um yeah, so it's the lesson people are the ones that are giving us the most support out of all the stuff that we do. And that's important, right? So I think it's important to acknowledge that. So many people look at the students as a necessary distraction or something like that. If they had a choice, they wouldn't have to teach. Does that make sense? I think a lot of people. I'm not saying all of them. Obviously, not all of them. But if they had a choice, they wouldn't teach. And for me, yeah, I just almost can't stop teaching. I knew I was a teacher when I was in elementary school, and I remember when there's this thing called metacognition. I'll put the word in the chat because I might not be pronouncing it right. Metacognition. I might not be spelling it right either. Okay. Metacognition is when you think about your thoughts. You think about thinking. And one of my earliest metacognitive experiences was when we lived in, we're going way, way back now, when we lived in, I think, Maryland. And that's so far back that I think my little brother wasn't born yet. So I must have been about 5 years old. And I remember taking my other two siblings out in the backyard and teaching them everything I knew. Wasn't that a great time to live in? I just described to you. Hey, 5 year old going out into the backyard, into the woods, um, with no parental supervision. Maybe I was a little older than 5, but it must not have been much older. And because I know for sure either my little brother wasn't born yet or he wasn't old enough to do that kind of thing, something like that, right? So I remember that there were, we have these here too, just don't see them as often. The little frogs, the little toads that are that big. And I remember we had like a swarm of them. I guess swarm is not the right word. A plague? A plague of them in our backyard. You could almost not help stepping on them. And I remember telling my siblings, teaching them about the little frogs and about the insects and all that stuff. So yes, I started teaching when I was a little kid. And I don't think I can turn that off. In fact, I had a friend of mine one time that was going through a hard time. And, you know, when people are going through a hard time, they don't want a teacher. They don't want someone to help them. They just want you to listen. And he hollered at me, says, Eddie, I don't need a teacher. And so I didn't speak to him again for like 6 months because I can't turn that off. I'm sorry. I don't know how to turn that off, you know? So it was just best that I didn't ruin his life with my suggestions about what he could do to make things better. Um, anyway, Seppo asks, how do you teach harmony for your students? As a young teacher and even not responsible of the harmony studies in my institution, I have been thinking of using the guide tones as written etudes for very young students. How do you think about that? Well, that's what I do. As soon as they start learning jazz, we do, I call them tendency tones, but it's the same thing. Um, now, I do believe that harmony has to begin on the horn, has to begin with arpeggios. I have my students doing arpeggios from almost the very beginning. There are some exceptions. It depends on the student, remember? There are some exceptions. I do not teach everybody the same way. So I have in my head an exception that I make for a adult student. He's a young adult. I think he's, if I had to guess, I think he's about 40 years old, maybe 35, 37 years old. And he just plays for fun. And no, I haven't taught him the arpeggios yet. Eventually I will. But I'll tell you what, the ones that are young, right? Um, if they're going through my system, and here's the thing, I never really wanted a system for the beginners because of this fact that they're all so very, very different. I think that the beginners are more different from everybody else. At every other level, the beginners are more different, more unique. And so my beginner method, I never intended it to be a set method. In fact, even if I ever do put it in a book, that still won't be set because of the different ways different people learn and the different where they are, like in now, like their teeth structure and all that stuff, and what they want to do with the music. But for those little ones, like I have one, I believe is first grade right now. What does that make him? Like 6 years old. Um, and I've been using with this student uh, all of the stuff that I think should be done, like we started with the expansion studies. And right now he's on the second level, the tribal level, and I've got etudes that I've written. He is learning about eighth notes right now, and that's the thing is it's remarkable how how well he's doing with all that. Now with him, we already did. We do C major triad, we do F major triad, we do G major triad. That's all we do for the beginners, just so they have their foot in the door on the arpeggios. To me, it makes no sense to work on harmony if they have no understanding of the arpeggios. And this is one of the criticisms I have of traditional jazz education. How do you work on so when I'm talking about harmony, I'm talking about when do the chords change? How do you do something like that where the chords are changing, but you don't actually know the individual arpeggios? Well, then, when you do those exercises that they do in traditional jazz education, when you do those exercises, they're kind of sort of meaningless. I'm going to say that again. Those exercises where they start by just playing the root of each chord and then they play the root and third of each chord and then they play root third and fifth of each chord. What is the point of that if they can't play those chords yet? All it becomes at that point is a technique exercise and it doesn't do anything to help them play jazz. I actually believe that the ones who go through that system and end up being great jazz players, it's in spite of the fact that they've been doing those exercises. It's not because there's nothing in those exercises that leads to being a good jazz player. All it does is give you technique and really the technique that you need to be able to play jazz is not really that much. At least not the way I teach. Um yeah, I know there's a lot of people that would be upset about me saying that. Um now the reason I do what you're calling guide tones with my students is because it teaches them the harmony without actually working on the harmony. It teaches them harmony in a way that is more melodic and more subconscious. It teaches them the harmony with their ear instead of their fingers and instead of their mind. So yes, I do those exercises. Um, Not at the beginner level though. I do that on the third level, my trumpet player level. Uh, Mr. Kirk, I mean Mr. Derek says, what techniques do lead to becoming a good jazz player? Um, I think the most important thing, aside from learning the tonalization studies, right? The tonalization studies teach you to think in that key. It's a mistake to think that those tonalization studies are there to give you material to play. There is a little bit of overlap like that. There is a tiny bit of, in those scale patterns, a tiny bit of stuff that you could use in your solos. That's not what it's for. That's not what it's for. Even so, it's really just there to train your ear. The tonalization studies are to help train your ear, train the patterns in your fingers, and give you the ability to think in that key. So that's not the main thing. To me, the main thing for becoming a good jazz player, and when let's be clear about it. What I mean by good jazz player is we're talking about the guys who improvise. We're not talking about someone that just sits in the section. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but there's not a lot of skill involved in just sitting in a section. Um, I did a video about that recently. You guys might have seen it. And I realized after I put that video out, there's a third category. There's the lead players. And once again, it takes as much effort to be a lead player as it is to be a jazz player as it is to be a classical player. So anyway, what techniques do lead to becoming a good jazz player? That's what I call the jazz language. And the way I like to demonstrate the jazz language is to improvise for you. I'm going to do it in slow motion. The jazz language, in my opinion, is made up of very predictable motifs. And I had a student that did, he's a saxophone player. He did a transcription of the tune we were working on, and a Sonny Stitt transcription. And we analyzed it for motivic content. And Sonny Stitt is one of those guys who, like almost 100% of his material is motivic when he improvises. Not everybody plays like that. But I tell you what, the great players all have some motivic content, otherwise, it doesn't sound like jazz. And that to me is what the jazz language stuff is. So let me give you an example. And this is fully improvised, and sometimes it doesn't go so well because I'm trying to go slow and think. So this was a string of motifs that I played. And the motifs are sort of like how we would use words in a sentence. One motif leads into the next, leads into the next, which leads into the next. Okay. And that's what I just did. Does it sound like jazz? Yes, it sounds like jazz. If I just improvise using scales and arpeggios and stuff, it doesn't sound necessarily bad, but it doesn't really sound like anything either, does it? It's not offensive, but it doesn't say anything. There's no, there's nothing being spoken. Well, I'm going to do another one of the motivic improv. So you can hear that the difference between the motivic one is that it actually sounds like jazz, and the one where I was just improvising scales doesn't really sound like anything. That's actually hard for me to do, the improving with just scales, like as an example of what not to do. That's hard. I've been playing motivically for so long now. It's hard for me to go back to that. Hello, Gary. Gary says, "Can you ever do guide? Oh, can you? Oh, can you overdo guide tones? I don't think so. Is it possible to overthink your improvisation and use too many guiding leading tones and not enough just keeping it simple and with simple bluesy licks and motifs?" Okay, that's a more specific question. Uh, Let me tell you this in answer to your question. When we improvise, we're not supposed to be thinking about anything. So, what you're describing to me, see, I tell my students we've got two types of improvisation. We have real improvisation on this side, and then on this side, we have improv exercises. They're not the same thing. With real improvisation, the whole point is to just turn your mind off and let the good stuff come out. Whatever comes out, and you accept it the way it is. An improv exercise is when you're trying to do something. And I teach all kinds of different improv exercises, a lot of different kinds of improv exercises. For example, the first improv exercise I was ever taught was the famous eighth note exercise, where the whole point is to improvise with a track and play nothing but eighth notes. And the only time you stop the eighth notes is to take a breath. We call that the eighth note exercise. It's an improvisation. You're still improvising, but you're making yourself only play eighth notes. Now, I think that that exercise, I think, comes from uh, educators that the their students are playing in their improv too many long notes. And their way to combat that was to tell them only play eighth notes in your improv now. And I still see the red light coming on. I hope it's not distorted. So yes, I think that's where that exercise first came from. To me, that's not why I do that exercise. That's not why I teach that exercise. The way I see it is we have a tendency to play in our conscious mind. Think of your conscious mind as a buffer for your subconscious mind. But when the buffer goes out, we have a tendency to stop, right? So you use up what's in here. I always use the I touch the front of my head for the conscious mind and the back of my head for the subconscious mind. That's just one of the things, one of my conventions. I don't know. Obviously, that's not how it works, but I like thinking of it as so. Think of it as an analogy or a metaphor, right? The front of the mind being your conscious mind, back of the mind being subconscious. If we're only playing jazz from our conscious mind, it's never going to be very good. And that's the kind of stuff I'm talking about with Gary, right? When we're improvising, we shouldn't be thinking like that. If it's real improv, don't think like that. Now, How do we change what's in your subconscious mind? Well, you got to do stuff with your conscious mind. So when we do the improv exercises, like the eighth note exercise, it helps train what goes on in our subconscious mind. By the way, that happens through repetition. We talked about repetition last week. Slow repetition is how you become a virtuoso. And so, anyways, what I believe with the eighth note exercise is that you empty your conscious mind, and the idea is to, after you run out of ideas, keep going. That's to me what the eighth note exercise is for, is to keep going after you run out of exercises. Why do we want that? Because when you keep going, at that point, you're being forced to go to source your material from your subconscious mind. Now, of course, if there's nothing in your subconscious mind, it's not going to sound good. That's why we do all this other stuff. Well, that's why we practice the tonalization studies. That's why we practice different tunes. That's why we practice the different aspects of um, the jazz language. Okay, so that we put that stuff in our subconscious mind, so that when the now I do believe that as we get better at this improv process, we can just tell ourselves stop thinking. One of the stories I like to tell from my career, Giant Steps was always like my worst tune. I really never, and I read books, and I got Giant Steps books and transcriptions and all kinds of stuff. One of the problems for me with Giant Steps was that all of the materials were for sax, and there was nothing trumpety in it whatsoever. So I spent 10 years putting materials together that I would practice. It ended up becoming a book that still sells. The book itself is not for everybody, obviously. It's for advanced jazz players. So we don't sell a lot of them. But it's called Train for Trumpet. And it's basically all those exercises that I created to help me learn giant steps. And like I said, it took me 10 years before I could play giant steps without any trouble. And then I had a gig shortly after that with my band at a jazz club here in Houston called Cezanne. Cezanne is no longer there. The University of St. Thomas took the building back. I think they actually leveled the building. Um, so Cezanne is gone. But yes, the I had a gig there shortly after I learned giant steps. After that 10 years, and the story that I tell students about is that I was improvising on giant steps and looking at my fingers, and instead of thinking about, hey, what am I going to play here, I was looking at my fingers and going, wow, look at that. That looks really cool. My mind wasn't trying to come up with ideas to play. My mind was just simply doing what sounded good to me in that moment. And all the notes that I played over those chord progressions were dead on with no effort. This is, by the way, I am not a big fan of what people call mindlessness. I'm not a big fan of what people call mindlessness in music. I'm sorry, I got it backwards. I'm not a big fan of mindfulness. That's what people are into now, is being mindful. And all the practice gurus that I've looked into, they're all into this being mindful thing. And you know what I think? the reason why that works. You know, you have to remember all the time that there's always money involved. And I think the reason why, and then they probably don't see it this way for themselves, right? I'm looking at this as a outside observer. I think the reason they teach mindfulness is because it's something that's not achievable. Great trumpet playing, great musicianship is not mindful, it's mindless. Like that story I just told you about my performance playing giant steps. That was so mindless that I could sit there and be amazed at what my fingers were doing. Like almost what people call an out of body experience, almost like that. It was like my fingers were doing their own thing, and I was just a casual observer. And so, yes, I'm not a big fan of mindfulness. Now, there is a time when we're practicing when you should be mindful. That's when you learn something new. And that's true whether it's a new scale or a new part of the music. So, yes, we have to, if we want to be great players, we have to alternate between the mindlessness and the mindfulness. We need to be able to alternate. We need to be able to, when something is new, be sure that we're playing it right. This is why we practice slow and do lots of repetition, because we don't want to stay in that state all the way. We want to be mindful long enough to create the habit. Then we switch. How do you know you're switching to mindlessness? You start to uh, daydream when you're practicing. And in fact, this is what they say you should never do. In fact, I've had students that got caught up in this mindfulness that when they caught themselves daydreaming in their lesson or in their practice time, they would berate themselves and criticize themselves for daydreaming while they practiced. When in reality, that's the ultimate goal. That's where we want to get with everything we do, to where we can do it perfectly without thinking. That's just another way of saying what we were talking about last week. The way you become a great player is to train yourself to be able to do what has to be done so well and so automatically that you don't have to think. And then if you don't have to think, your mind is free to wander. When you don't have to think, you can daydream about lunch, you can daydream about the chicken, the second row, you can daydream about all that stuff, and it's still going to go well. Gary asks, what do you think about improvising by hearing what you want in your head and being able to reproduce that on the trumpet? Is that what we should be striving for? Yes and no. Once again, to me, that's an exercise. Do that as an exercise. Um, it actually is an exercise in a book by, I think the book is called Improvising Jazz. Let me do a search on it real quick. I forget the guy's name. Oh no, that's the name of the Harry Coker book. Um, it's a trombone player, I think. Yes, I don't know the name of the book. Yeah, I don't know the name of the book. Anyway, it's the a trombone player that teaches or used to teach at what's that name of the school in Boston? Not Boston U, the other one. Berkeley. Trombone player had a great book, and it's got basically it's full of what I call today improv exercises, and that was one of the exercises. Here, you make yourself hear a lick in your head, and then you make yourself play what you hear, and you do that over and over again. Um, and then he would do different versions of the same exercise, right? He would say, hear a lick in your head, then hear a second lick, and then play the first lick. I'll tell you what, when I did that, I went through the whole book. When I did that, I was amazed at just how hard it was. But I can tell you there's a lot of benefit to doing that kind of exercise. Maybe the book was called How to Improvise. Oops. Yes, it's called How to Improvise by Hal Crook. And it's a very advanced book. I don't recommend it for beginners, but it's full of these kinds of exercises. You do the exercises so that your mind is trained that when you go to the gig, but I'm going to tell you that not everything that you play. So think about what was going in my mind with that giant step story. I wasn't thinking, oh, let me hear this and then I'll play what I hear. I wasn't thinking that. The stuff was just coming out and it was great. Yes, of course there is an element of hearing it and then playing it. Of course there is that. But at the deepest level, I don't think we do that. I think at the deepest level, when we improvise, it's just so automatic that that process is no longer involved. Um, Jeffrey says, in the zone. That's right. That's what a lot of people would call it, right? You're doing it well without thinking about it. Shouldn't that be? Talking about the mindfulness. Shouldn't it doesn't make any sense to me that people wouldn't want to be mindless. It just doesn't make any sense to me. Seppo says, "What would be your suggestion on the most beneficiary style of teaching to listen the tendency tones for very young students?" You know, um, the tendency tones that I do first are so easy that yeah, so it's not really a problem. Um, by the way, I always I have what I call the jazz canon. This is the order of songs that we go through. Um, and all of the stuff in my 5 areas of jazz study are connected to those songs. We do those songs in that order. And so the first thing we're going to do is after we learn the head on the first song is that um we're going to do uh the Tennessee tones. That's the first thing after we learn the head. Now, I guess you could have, if you wanted to do. So you guys wouldn't know this because I don't talk about it much. One of the things that I do to simplify the music so that the students, like talking about the beginners, so that they learn the most of what they can learn, is I shorten the etudes, I shorten the exercises. We rarely have exercises longer than 4 to 8 measures. Same thing with the songs. Rarely do we do songs that are longer than 4 or 8 measures. So you could do tendency tone studies that are just, um, 4 bars long. I don't do that. But if you wanted them to have something even earlier in their progress, like at the beginner level, as soon as they're competent on the notes, you could have them do the tendency tones on a 4 bar 2-5-1 lick, right? Da 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 dee, and then that's it. So Gary says, with regards to the 12-bar blues in C on the 5-7 chord, guiding tones could be the B natural or F natural. That's right. But the blues scale has a B flat. That's right. So what note would you be best for the blues scale note? So first of all, I don't teach the blues as a scale. Um, the problem with doing the blues as a scale is that you treat that F sharp. Let's say we're talking about C blues. You treat that F sharp as if it's a um, part of the scale, and that's not how it works in the actual music. That F sharp is usually used in a way that's separated from the pentatonic scale. So basically, the blues is a pentatonic, minor pentatonic, right, with that extra F sharp. If you learn it with the F sharp in it, now you've turned something that should be really, really cool into something that's very, very predictable. So that's the first thing. I don't teach blues scale. I teach the pentatonic as the first step to learning blues, the minor pentatonic. Um, and you can do so much with that. You can do so much with that. Um, let me see what your question says. So over that, if we're doing the tendency tones over the blues, should it be B flat or B natural on the 5 chord? It should be B natural. Because the reason why we're doing the the tendency tones is to train your ear to the chords. And even though you could play the B flat over that chord, or the E flat for that matter, um, so does that make sense? Even though you could improvise over that, the purpose of the tendency tones is to learn the chord progression by ear, not technically in your fingers. That other exercise is better for that. But no, we do the tendency tones so we hear what the chord notes are without having to get too deep into the technique of it. I hope that makes sense. Any other questions? So let me tell you guys that next week we will not have a Q and A. And the reason for that is because I have a gig with my band in the morning. And since I have that gig with my band, that means I have to do my dialysis in the afternoon. So I will not be available to, unless you guys want to have. I'm kidding. Uh, unless you guys want to have Q and A during my dialysis. I'm sure my neighbor wouldn't be very happy about that. And I mean my chair neighbor, right? We sit in chairs while they suck our blood. Um, and my neighbor uh, would not appreciate me having a conversation like that. Any other questions? We've got time for one more. How's the weather there in Houston? The weather is cold today. Probably not what you guys would consider cold, but it's cold for Houston. Um, we have, I think, the lows in the 40s for the next couple days, I think. Gary says, continuing on the C blues on the 1-7 chord, should it be an E natural or E flat while improvising? So, or both, or does it matter? Are there even wrong notes? No, there's no wrong notes. There are no wrong notes. It's not what you play, it's how you play it. So when you're actually improvising, you just play what comes out. When you're actually improvising, you and you know what? I think some people misunderstand that. They think that what I'm saying is if you train properly, you can just turn your mind off and then everything will come out the way it's supposed to. No. We accept what comes out. Okay? We accept what comes out. It doesn't matter what the notes are. Yes, over time, the more training you do, the more the notes you play will make sense. But they don't have to make sense. And in fact, a lot of times when the notes do make sense, it's only because somebody took their music theory class and looked back at what you played and said, oh, look, here's this, here's that, here's this, here's that. When in reality, you weren't thinking that way, not on the conscious level, not even on the subconscious level. You weren't thinking that way at all. So, yes, I'm a firm advocate of just playing what comes out and accepting that for what it is. Does that mean when you first start playing that way, you're ready for Carnegie Hall? Absolutely not. There's something that happens over time when you keep doing what I'm talking about, when you keep playing with your mind turned off, there's something that happens that turns what you're doing into some beautiful music. Jeffrey says, I agree with the term mindfulness makes no sense. Now, it's quite possible, right? It's quite possible that my interpretation of what they mean by that is not what they mean. It's quite possible. Hello, Larry. Nice to see you. Larry says, someone once showed Sonny Rollins a transcribed solo of one of his improvisations. He said, I played that. No, I have the same story that I say, but it's about Charlie Parker. Of course, this is all jazz lore, right? The story I heard was that Charlie Parker, one of his fans came with a transcription of Charlie Parker that he played and said, "Will you play this for me?" And the guy says, "Are you crazy? I can't play that." That's the story I tell. It's basically the same story. It's part of jazz improv lore. Yeah, see, Jeffrey says, like the Beatles writing music and someone transcribed the music. Yeah, that's right. That's what we're talking about. The best music comes from your subconscious, not your conscious mind. And that's true whether it's classical music or jazz or whatever. The whole so think about it. What does it mean to be a virtuoso? You're nailing the music and you're playing it in most cases when we say virtuoso, we're talking about how fast something is. Okay? You're playing it really, really, really fast, faster than most people ever could, but you're not missing a note. Tell me how you're supposed to do that with your mind. If it's not automatic, you can't do that. If it's not automatic, that's impossible to play that fast and not make mistakes. It's impossible. But for your subconscious mind, it's not impossible. You guys have heard of idiot savants, people who could do remarkable things, but their intelligence is at compromise or whatever. I have a theory that the reason why the savants can do what they do is because their conscious mind is not in the way. I don't have evidence for that, but that's my theory. That's what I suspect. Is that the reason they do so well is because they're not thinking about it. And in fact, there's a book that I would recommend. Let me, because this book, now I had already decided on all this stuff through trial and error with my playing, trial and error with my students. There's a book called Choke. I'm going to give you the link here. The woman who wrote it is a neuroscientist or something like that at the University of Chicago. And she talks about what I'm talking about. I had already figured all this stuff out on my own, but her book taught me, not taught me, her book confirmed everything that I'm saying here. Ha! Jeffrey says the Beatles rode across town on bicycles to learn the B7 chord on guitar. All right, guys, that's good. Thank you once again for hanging out. We will not have a Q and A next week, but probably we will have the week after that. Okay? All right. Well, God bless you. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next time.